think so. Doesn't matter. Okay. So here begins our next lecture. In the record session, this is about analytical anarchism. And we have a speaker, Lode Cossaer of SFL. He's in the executive board. And, well, a valuable member. He studied philosophy and, well, I think he held this lecture before in Bonn, and I heard good recommendations for this, and, well, I think it will be good. And here's he, and let's go. I don't know.
Thanks, Köln Libertarians, if I pronounce it correctly, to invite me. Just because I'm in the ESFL executive board doesn't actually mean you get like a free passage to lecture on these things. You actually have to prove yourself worthy. I gave a talk recently, like a month ago, on analytical anarchism for the local group. So I decided to change the content a little bit, so that if someone is like forced to sit in this lecture, that he or she can sort of get some new information. So what is analytical anarchism? Another possible title for my talk would have been Why Somalia is Awesome, but not for the reasons that the naive libertarians that Tom Palmer mentioned earlier thinks. Another possible title could be Why I'm Not a Minarchist. But the reason why I don't choose that title, and I only would choose that title if I were to speak to a bunch of libertarians, is because this is not a talk about libertarianism. It is a talk about a topic within the social sciences. This is a social science talk. However, there will be some implications for libertarianism, and given the audience, I will point them out, but I could give a very similar talk in front of a room of social scientists that have nothing to do with libertarianism as such. So there are 5 parts: an introduction, cooperation in non-perfect markets, origin of institutions, comparative anarchism, and conclusion. And such as most talks, I will start with an introduction. So like I said, it's not about libertarianism. It is relevant for social scientists. How to use the term anarchy in this talk? Anarchy, amongst libertarians, is usually meant something like anarcho-capitalism, right? Private property rights defended by private courts, private police, private justice, etc. Somewhere in the back of my head, I'm in favor of such a system, but that is not what this talk is about. It is the way to use anarchy in this talk is a description of societies with non-ideal political orders. So a description of societies with non-ideal political orders. Political orders where stuff is not ideal, right? Where bad stuff happens, where property rights are not perfect, cooperation is not perfect, etc. And the reason why this talk is important is because Tom said we as classical liberals focus on principles, processes, and institutions. And that's true, right? We don't say we want fair prices for everyone. No, we say we want markets that determine prices because we think that those markets are best at determining prices, at rationing scarce goods, etc. However, even saying that we want processes and institutions is not a deliberate choice that we can make. We can try to have social action and social change towards more markets, but you can't just suddenly clap your hands and say, damn, now we have markets, right? Think about the transition from Soviet Russia towards more free market economies. Some countries did better, some countries did worse than other countries. But it wasn't suddenly, they couldn't suddenly choose, and now we have well-defined property rights. Now we have a rule of law. Now we have contractual freedom. That's not how evolution towards market economies happens. So that is why this talk is important. This research of analytical anarchism started with an article in 2004 by a guy who works for the IMF, right? The IMF, very mainstream organization. And he wrote an article, it's only 2 pages, very easy to read, that's called Assume Anarchy. And he talks about saying, when we write about development economics, for example, we always sort of implicitly assume perfect markets, right? What are some of the characteristics of perfect markets? Anyone can think of something? Transparency, perfect knowledge, yes? Efficiency. Well, that's a conclusion. Yeah, that would also be one of them. I've narrowed it down to perfect information, perfectly enforced property rights and contractual obligations, and non-corrupt public goods providing government, right? To the extent that the government should provide public goods, it does so efficiently and non-corrupt. And he says, well, why do we assume this? Well, we sort of assume this in economics because we think or we assume it's a reasonable approximation of reality. Yeah, we know that this is not completely accurate, but we think it's a reasonable approximation. Well, and then if you read the article, you can see him sort of pointing and laughing at the social scientists who assume this, because in what universe is this a reasonable approximation of reality? It's not a reasonable approximation in reality in the Western world, but it's definitely not a reasonable approximation in failed states or in developing countries, right? So he says, no, we should do this the other way around. We should assume anarchy. We should assume, for better or for worse, that nothing is enforceable. That property and individual rights are totally insecure. That all enforcement of contracts must be derived from first principles, meaning self-enforcing and self-reinforcing contracts. What does that mean? It means that if there's a contract, the only way that we can assume that it will be enforced is because all actors have an incentive to have it enforced. And obviously non-perfect knowledge, right? People never have perfect knowledge, definitely not in markets where knowledge is even less accessible than in more developed markets. So if this is analytical anarchism, if this is, we should assume anarchy and then see how we can derive cooperation. 3 important questions come up, and those 3 questions match the 3 parts of the rest of my talk. How can we have cooperation in non-ideal situations? Can institutions arise that generate cooperation that are not dependent on a state, right? Can institutions arise that generate cooperation not dependent on the state? And the most difficult one is, can functioning anarchy be comparatively better than such a thing as a state? So those are the 3 main questions. Part 1. Why do we want cooperation? Well, basic economics. If X and Y cooperate, they can do more than each of them could do alone. If not for absolute advantage, there is always comparative advantage, and just 2 people can specialize more. They have access to certain things that one person can't do. But the question is, how can you achieve cooperation, right? It's one thing to say you and I can cooperate. You and I have, in theory, the possibility that we can do more than individual. But how can I trust you, right? What? Bad cooperation. How can I trust that if I cooperate with you, at the end of the day, you won't clobber me on the head, right? We have the Hobbesian answer, very typical. We just assume a state. But even in Hobbes' theory, there is one fundamental question. Hobbes talks about, I can't trust you, you can't trust me, there is a war of everybody against everyone, so we should just trust a secondary actor. But again, why should we trust that secondary actor? Why can't the Leviathan, Hobbes' work, just take over power from everyone? So this is a very bad answer. It doesn't solve the problem of trust, doesn't solve the problem of cooperation. But we see that cooperation happens where property rights don't matter relative to cooperation. What kind of situation do you think where cooperation is more relevant than property rights protection? very poor situations, right? In a situation where both parties have literally nothing, or approximately nothing, then it's probably almost always the case that cooperation is better than competition. But for example, failed state regions. When 50,000 years ago mankind were just cavemen wandering around, those kind of examples, cooperation is probably always better than competition. Because there's so comparatively little to gain from clobbering the other guy on the head, right? However, not even Hobbes denied this. If you read Hobbes, he talks about, yes, if there's very little going on, you can form sort of these small associations, but we still have a problem from widespread social cooperation, right? How can we have functioning societies of millions and millions of people who still cooperate? And the basic idea of the basic problem, the way I see it, is that you need to create self-enforcing interactions. The more interactions you have that are self-enforcing, the more cooperation you'll generate. What is a self-enforcing interaction? Well, an interaction where both parties have maximum, quote unquote, benefits from adhering to the contract, either in the long or in the short term, right? What is a self-enforcing contract? A contract where you don't get the benefits unless I get the benefits and vice versa. Well, if that's our contract, or if we can design a contract like that, or an interaction, then it's probably a good chance that we both respect the contract, right? Because only if we both respect it is when we both benefit from it. So the problem of cooperation on sort of the basic level is, how can we create self-enforcing interactions? And we need to remember by this that respect of property rights of other people is a choice. It is an interaction. So part of the problem of self-enforcing interactions is, how can we make sure that it is in our own benefit to respect other people's property rights? Again, there is this sort of implicit assumption here that people are selfish, right? Obviously, in the real world, people additionally...
That's been crazy.
In the actual world, people are not just selfish. People can be altruistic to an extent, can feel empathy towards others. However, as a working assumption, if we can prove that cooperation can work with purely selfish people, it's probably also the case with people who are not purely selfish. That's why we have as a sort of functioning, working hypothesis, pure self-interest. But again, respect of property rights is a choice, is an interaction, right? The fact that I meet you and respect your property rights, even if I don't do anything else, that is an interaction, that is a choice that I made. And I'll probably do it, if we assume that I'm a psychopathic, self-interested guy, only if it's to my self-benefit. Here is one example of how we can, of a very interesting example of how someone or a group of people turned a predatory interaction into a self-enforcing, mutually beneficial interaction. In 19th century Angola, what happened there was you had very sedentary farmers and stuff like that. They were physically or military-wise were they weak. They couldn't put up much of a fight. And you had Western people, what's the English word? They were traveling around. Originally, they were buying stuff from those local farmers, but after a while, they suddenly realized, well, we are military-wise much, much stronger. So they started roving the local sedentary farmers and stuff like that. So the farmers or the local people knew, well, if we create stuff, they'll just steal it. So what did they do? They stopped creating stuff. So the next time those roving bandits basically came by, they had nothing to steal. And they managed to make an agreement, and the local people said, you pay us now, and the next time you'll come by, we'll make sure that you can take stuff that you used to take for free, but that we stop producing because you were stealing it from us, right? So here was the situation where the roving bandits were predating on local people, said, well, then we'll stop producing. And that's how they turned that parasitic interaction into a mutually beneficial interaction. Where was the self-enforcing mutually beneficial interaction? Well, the rich roving bandits paid them, and the local farmers then had an incentive to produce the goods, because if they didn't produce the goods, well, they were from a military point of view stronger. If they didn't produce the goods that the other ones bought, they would have just been destroyed. Everybody benefited from this interaction. Another kind of effect, or another kind of way of making self-enforcing interaction is through reputation, right? If someone's reputation is at stake and he needs his reputation to do other kinds of interactions with others, he or she will have a high incentive to respect that interaction, right? Suppose we interact and the fact that you're trustworthy as someone to interact with is a necessary condition for you to actually be able to interact with other people. Well, if you default on me, if you cheat on me, your reputation will have the risk to be destroyed, and then you'll lose out yourself, right? Reputation effects create self-enforcing mechanisms. The better your reputation is in business, the more cooperation you can do. The less the less your reputation is, the less interactions you can do. Okay. This was on a very basic level how we can have, and some examples of cooperation in non-perfect markets, right? We didn't have to assume perfect property rights, we didn't have to assume perfect contractual obligations. We just focused on, even in those limited circumstances, how do both parties can create an incentive to cooperate without all these perfect assumptions. How can we have institutions, non-governmental institutions, to arise? Well, can institutions arise that generate cooperation? Now I want to tell you a story about trust. And the basic conclusion of this story is that society runs through a network of trust and expectations through proxies, right? We have A and we have C. A and C don't know each other, so they have no reason to trust each other. How can A trust C? Well, suppose that we have another person or another organization called B. A trusts B and B trusts C. Well, depending on how strong that trust is, this can create an effect that A suddenly manages to trust C. And you know this probably from your personal life, right? You're at the bar, you're meeting up with a friend, you see some other weird dude, right? Suddenly your friend arrives and he happens to know that weird dude. Just because, in virtue of the fact that your friend knows that other person, you'll probably adjust your benefit, you'll probably give him more the benefit of the doubt from, oh, maybe that's a cool guy because my friend trusts him and I trust my friend, right? I don't know about you, but this has happened to me in several occasions. But the end result of this, that is A trusts C. And this is a way of understanding lots and lots of different trust mechanisms in society. Let me give you another example. Who has ever been to McDonald's? Probably most. Most of you may, well, if you're not an economics student, you might not know this, but there is no such thing as McDonald's overseeing everything, right? Every single McDonald's is franchised from McDonald's, right? They pay McDonald's a certain fee, and they have a certain contract in exchange for the rights to use the logo, to use their stuff, and then in exchange McDonald's does the main McDonald's company checks regularly whether or not the quality is okay and stuff like that. But you don't need to know this, right? You see the McDonald's logo and you know what to expect. Maybe not the best quality in the world, but you know what to expect. So in a city where you don't know the local food and you don't feel very adventurous, you just go to McDonald's. You know what to expect. You trust the logo, And McDonald's has a contract with the local franchise guy. They trust them. They probably have an ongoing interaction. And that's how the chain of trust works. You don't need to know the guy behind the counter. You don't need to know the local manager of that particular McDonald's. No, you don't care because you trust the McDonald's logo. And McDonald's has an incentive to make sure their local branches are trustworthy. The way to compare this is a little bit with the economics idea of middlemen, right? In economics, you have this idea of like speculators. Speculators create information, and if they're successful, they can earn money from it. Well, the analogy that I want to make is that middlemen also create trust. And trust is a valuable commodity. Trust creates or makes interaction and cooperation possible. Because they create this trust, which is a valuable commodity, they can earn money because of it. So the fundamental point here is that trust is created through cooperation and interaction, right? I trust you, you trust him, I trust him. And this goes on ad infinitum, right? When I arrive here in Köln, well, I've been here before, but like the first time that I arrived here, I saw lots of people, local people, take the metro. Well, this signals to me, well, the metro is probably trustworthy, right? I don't need to look up beforehand, is the metro in Köln trustworthy? I just arrive here and I see lots of people take it. Again, they signal trust, and I've just followed their lead. So, what is an example of this? Another example of this is credit card companies, right? Whenever I go to the United States and I pay in a restaurant where I've never been before, I just use my credit card, right? Well, the restaurant doesn't need to trust me. The restaurant trusts my credit card company. And the credit card company regularly checks whether or not I pay my credit card dues, and they trust me because of it, right? All of these connections are based on trust and partially, or at least partially, based on mutually enforcing contracts, right? If I don't pay my dues to the credit card company, I lose my credit card. And if the credit card company doesn't provide a valuable service to me, they'll lose customers. But how can we have this grow on into like institutions that create cooperation without us deliberately, without having to deal with the state? Well, one example of that is the law merchants, or the lex mercantoria, if you want to be like fancy in Latin and shit. So the law merchant is a system of law between merchants, right? So it evolved, when was it? 15th century, 16th century, something like that? I should have looked this up. And it spread all across Europe originally. And it basically, if you were a merchant, and you had a problem with another merchant, you didn't go to the state's courts, if there were any at best. No, you went to the law merchant. The law merchant was private, so they had the courts of the law merchant were private. They had no legal means to like punish you or throw you in jail. But what they could do is convict you of, say, oh, you cheated on him, you should pay him a fine. And if you didn't pay a fine, well, they published it far and wide, and they ostracized you from the merchant community. This created a big incentive to not cheat on the other guy, and if you did cheat and the law merchant courts convicted you, well, you better pay up or you would have been kicked out of the merchant class. So again, this is at least partially dependent on the possibility for self-enforcing contracts, right? The merchant courts had an incentive to provide a valuable service, and you had an incentive to pay the merchant courts for their valuable service. Otherwise, they wouldn't contract. The next time you would show up, they just wouldn't hear your case. So all of this generates self-enforcing interaction. By the way, even today, there are these international courts who deal with merchant cases. I wrote a few one down. The London Court of International Arbitration, the International Center for Dispute Resolution, the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce. All of these organizations, which you have probably never heard of, are the ones that make international commerce possible. When there is disagreement between international merchants or modern companies, then they are the ones that solve it, not your local state court. But now the question is, and this is more a libertarian question, can these kind of institutions carry a society? Are these sufficient? Well, let's talk about that in the next part. Comparative anarchism. Here I want to make 2 points. The first one is a very libertarian point, I'll admit, I smuggled it in. Can we really get out of anarchy? Can we ever really get out of anarchy? This is me symbolizing, with dots and lines, anarchy, right? Lots of people interacting, there's chaos. Well, chaos in the sense of there's no central plan, there's no central order designed by any particular organization. However, in the situation of a state, you have sort of a state overseeing it all, right? Providing background institutions. In the modern Western state, stuff like social security, basic property rights, defense and stuff like that are all done more or less by the state. So you could say, well, the state sort of takes away the element of anarchy and sort of regulates it from a point of view. Well, let's now zoom in on that yellow dot that the state is. Who is the boss of Germany? Who has the ultimate final power in Germany? Does she? Is there no one that can ever contradict anything she does? Most Western countries, but even in dictatorships, there is not really such a thing as the ultimate boss, right? It all depends on this network of trust and cooperation within the state, right? Take for example, the separation of powers, the legislative, judicial, and executive. They sort of have this balance of power, and sometimes they try to wingle and try to get more power. But ultimately, there's not one person in charge, right? Even if Angela Merkel makes a decision, it's still sort of backed up by the police and the army, and sort of the legislative power needs to have a role there in somewhat. My point is that the state is not a structured organization like you would sometimes see it in a textbook model, but it is something like this, right? Some people within the state, such as Angela Merkel, probably have more power than others, but it's more a sort of microcosmos of anarchy where nobody really is in charge than a really structured organization where there is the ultimate power by some person. So the question is, do we ever really get out of anarchy? A state, in best case scenario, abolishes anarchy for the rest of us, but in itself is always in a constant state of anarchy. Now, that doesn't necessarily imply any libertarian conclusion, but it is something to think about. Now I want to talk about this other thing called Somalia. Here is the way, or I'm going to try to give the correct way of presenting the quote-unquote Somalia case. Short history of Somalia, it had a ruthless socialist dictatorship, self-declared socialist and actual socialist dictatorship that collapsed in 1991. And what followed was what you could describe warlord anarchy. Let's be clear about that. It was sort of warlord clan-based anarchy. And anarchy not in the anarcho-capitalist kind. Now I'm going to show you some data with a small caveat. The data that we can give makes no distinction between Puntland, Somaliland, and the genuine anarchist part of Somalia. So Somalia, as it was, split up into 3 parts. Puntland and Somaliland sort of had a government, but not really. And then you have the 3rd part, which was genuinely, quote-unquote, anarchist. And here is the data from that period of time. I'm not sure if you can read it, but on 2 metrics, given the data that they could collect, on 2 metrics, the data was less than during the socialist dictator state. So GDP per capita, adult literacy, and combined school enrollment were 3 of the measured data that went down. And all the other data, most have to do with health, mortality, doctors, immunization, vaccination, extreme poverty, telephones, radios, and all of that, given the data available, went up. And an important part is that this does not take into account the gains in, well, sort of social freedoms, right? So a very defining characteristics of a socialist dictatorship is that they don't tolerate freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Socialist dictatorships, or dictatorships in general, hate that. But the warlords, they were in it for the money. They didn't really care about you saying bad stuff about your neighbor. So these economic measures don't really take into account additional liberties that were gained on that front. However, on the other hand, we don't have to celebrate victory. What happened was that the large, especially the anarchist part of Somalia, fell back on their traditional law. It's called Zeer law or something like that. And the Zeer law is not ideal, far from it. From a libertarian point of view, they had a few good things. Very strong property rights defense, a very restitution-based rather than a retribution-based criminal system. They have no lawmakers that can unilaterally declare laws. But on the other hand, they had also a lot of problems. Women had lesser status, outsiders were hardly recognized, it was very difficult to inherit some kinds of properties and stuff like that. So it was not ideal, but that was sort of the law system they had, they knew, so when the central government collapsed, they fell back on that. Okay, back to the data. So this data shows lots of improvements, again, given the caveat of the data that we could collect. But you could say, well, the majority of the world went ahead during that time period, right? Isn't this just a show of the general trend in the world? Well, if you look at the surrounding countries at the time, Kenya, Djibouti, and Ethiopia, and you compare the data you have available from Somalia with those countries, Somalia doesn't score particularly bad either, right? So they score very bad on adult literacy. One possible hypothesis is if the government doesn't force you to read, you have other priorities. But for telephones, population with access to improved sanitations and stuff like that, all of those, they don't score too bad, and some things they actually do better than the central government. Again, the argument here is not Somalia is awesome. The argument here is maybe there is some truth that comparatively anarchist institutions or more anarchist institutions or more decentralized institutions can actually outcompete central government. So Somalia, on a lot of margins, improved after the collapse of the central government. Western democracies might actually be better than Somalia warlord anarchism, but Western democracies is not an available alternative, right? Like I said in the beginning, you can't just magically have markets appear, you can't have magically functioning Western democracies appear. Well, then we have to just look at what is the relevant alternative. And here is something that I find puzzling. Our states managed to capture our trust. They managed to somewhat overcome the who guards the guardian problem. And why would I trust a state problem? But are they the only institutions that can do this, right? We trust the states, even if we're libertarians, we somewhat trust our Western governments. But why do we do this? How did they manage to overcome our trust problem? And are they the only ones? So my conclusion. Traditional view is that markets are great, but we need good institutions. My take is cooperation is great, and when markets are lacking, the institutions necessary can emerge through cooperation because of cooperation. They are intertwined, right? If I want to cooperate with you and I don't have an institution such as a state to make it happen, I can try to find ways to make that cooperation happen. But if it doesn't happen spontaneously, quote unquote, it seems hard to imagine that outside force and outside state could just suddenly appear from magic and make that cooperation happen. So we need to assume anarchy if we do social science. Lots of requirements for interaction don't necessarily require a state, and even if there is a state, the state cannot carry the burden of everything. At best, a state can be a useful addition to all of these trust mechanisms, but at worst, it's a damaging predator. The society runs on a network of trust, and external enforcement is not necessary for interaction. And I'm going to add to that conclusion that a society that leads less external enforcement, even if it's private, is probably a better society. And we need to find institutions that are self-enforcement, that promote self-enforcement. Another conclusion is the state changes the structure of anarchy, and the Leviathan states might actually be worse than anarchy. One more bonus for libertarians, and here is why I'm not a minarchist, based on this talk. Minarchists, if I can be so bold, want a state that does safety and property rights protection, police, the army, and they want justice, rule creation, judicial decision, and enforcement. But one conclusion that I want to make is all of these are very different things that are relevant at very different points, right? If I want to make a meaningful contract with you, I don't necessarily need a lot of police, but when I'm somewhere where I feel uncomfortable, then I need police, and I don't necessarily need a rule creator. Why can't those things be offered by different companies whom I trust for very different reasons? People have marginal and subjective differences in opinion on this. And again, the fundamental point, and this is my last point, the emergence of institutions happens through cooperative behavior. When I want to cooperate with you, that is when we evolve, or that's when we design institutions to make it happen. Why do we think we need an outside, monopolistic and coercive organization to make this happen? And how is it possible that we manage to have such an organization, to trust it, and that it ultimately is still so capable of doing lots of good stuff, relatively speaking, in a historical context? That is what might puzzle, but I'll close for now. Thank you for your attention.